Well, welcome. It's good to have another opportunity to study with you in the patriarchal age, looking at, in this lesson, Solomon's reign, starting with 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 13, his establishment on his throne, his wisdom that is given to him by God because he was well-pleasing to the Lord in the question that when he made a request of God. And we'll look at some examples of that wisdom and also his construction of the temple in fulfillment of what was promised to David. And then we'll look at God's response to the temple being built. That takes you down to chapter 9 and verse 9. So as you look at the beginning of Solomon's reign, you have a second conspiracy to try to take the throne from Solomon after the death of David. And that's discussed in chapter 2:13 through chapter 13 and verse 1, as Solomon is consolidating his rule after the death of his father. The plot that Adonijah, his older brother, had tried to take the throne away from him before David died. And he had promised his brother Solomon, when Solomon spared his life, that he would just be a common citizen. But we see his plot working itself out in verses 13 through 18, where he comes to Bathsheba, the father of Solomon, or the mother of Solomon, and asks that he might marry Abishag, which was the young virgin that was married to David, but he never consummated the marriage. He never had sexual relationships with her in his old age. And he, makes a pitiful appeal that, he's the older brother. The kingdom should have been his, but he doesn't have the kingdom, but he's in love with Abishag, and appeals to Bathsheba because of her influence, that Solomon wouldn't turn her down, to go and ask for the hand of Abishag so that he could marry her. And we're told that Bathsheba was deceived by this. She went in and made the request of Solomon. He gave her a warm greeting and said that he would give her whatever she asked. And she said that she wanted him to agree to let Abishag marry Adonijah, his brother. And Solomon said, what would I might as well ask to give him the kingdom, because he's my older brother. If he takes charge of David's wife, then he would have a claim to the throne again. And he mentions in his angry response about Joab and Abiathar, the high priest, that they have been involved in this some way. I don't know if he had some intelligence or whatever that made him suspect that they were involved in this plot of Adonijah. But he took an oath that Adonijah was going to die because he had gotten involved in another plot to take his life. So Benaiah, the chief bodyguard, was sent to execute Adonijah. And he was put to death that day because of his plotting against Solomon. And then he calls for Abiathar, and Abiathar the priest is told that he's going to retire from the priesthood and go and live at Anathoth, the city to the north east of Jerusalem, a priestly city there, and spend his life and retirement there, and not any longer have the priesthood. So Abiathar, his life is spared because he had suffered so many things and been loyal to David, his father. And so Abiathar is removed from the priesthood, and that fulfills the prophecy that was given to the house of Eli, because he wouldn't discipline his sons. Back at the beginning of the book of 1 Samuel, the prophecy was given that his priestly line would no longer be serving any longer, and Abiathar is the last of that line, and he is removed from the priesthood. And it goes to Zadok and his family then to be the high priest. Then Joab, word is sent to arrest him. He hears about the death of Adonijah, and he flees to the temple, which, it shows kind of a sign of a guilty conscience that he thinks that the king would come for him next. And he grabs hold of the horns of the altar, trying to get sanctuary and to be spared. And Benaiah was sent there to put him to death, and he sent word back to Solomon about what he should do, since he was holding on to the horns of the altar. And he said if he won't leave, and then just kill him there. And he was put to death. So these two threats, there's three, conspirators there that are taken care of. Shimei was another man that David had told Solomon that he needed to deal with. He had great influence in the house of Benjamin and in the family of Saul. And he had cursed David when he left and threw dirt at him and so on. And his life was spared by David. But Solomon needs to deal with him as well. So he calls Shimei in and tells him to build his city, his house, in the city of Jerusalem, and not to leave that city for any purpose. If he leaves the city, then he's going to forfeit his life. So he's not able to have any influence if he's living there in Jerusalem of going into the land of Benjamin or causing any trouble there. Well, we're told that he stayed on probation there in Jerusalem for 3 years, but he heard about a couple of his servants fleeing over to the king of Gath. And he saddled his donkey and took off and went over to Gath to bring his servants back. And Solomon heard about it. And then he said, you took an oath that you wouldn't leave Jerusalem. You cursed his father, and now his blood is on his own head. And he was executed. And again, so Solomon dealt with these enemies and is able to take care of all of those that had conspired and worked against his father as well. Then we're told in chapter 3 and verse 1 about an unprecedented marriage that Solomon had with Pharaoh's daughter. This is something that the Pharaohs never did, was give their daughters to make covenants with other nations. But there was an exception made at this time with Solomon, which shows about the strength of the kingdom of Israel at that time. And so he marries Pharaoh's daughter. And later he's going to build a special palace, house for her to live in there in the city of Jerusalem. We're told in history later that when the kingdom of Babylon arose and became powerful, that they wanted to enter into a marriage contract with the Pharaoh, and he would not give his daughter to the king of Babylon. So it was really a unique thing that Solomon was married to Pharaoh's daughter. Then you're told about how it was that Solomon gained his great wisdom as a gift from God. In chapter 3 and verses 2 through 15, we're told that Solomon went up to Gibeon. That's where the tabernacle was located in those days, and the altar of burnt offerings, and he offered sacrifices there to God, and it pleased God. And God appeared to Solomon in a dream and asked what his request was. In verse 9, so give thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of thine? Well, God was well pleased that Solomon asked for that rather than wealth or long life or power over his enemies. And so he granted him wisdom, a discerning heart, and riches in addition to these things, and honor. And as far as a long life was concerned, it would be only if he were faithful to God in his life like David had been. So Solomon, after he had that dream and got that request given to him by God, he went to Jerusalem, appeared before the Ark of the Covenant, and offered other sacrifices. And they had a great feast with all of his servants, being able to eat from the sacrifices that he offered. So Solomon starts off in a very good stead with God. We're told about a demonstration of the great wisdom that God granted him that was greater than any man before him or after him in his discerning ability and ability to pass judgment. There were a couple of prostitutes that lived together, and they both had become pregnant and had given birth to children just a few days apart. The first woman gave birth to a child, and then the other woman did, and her child died because she laid on her child. And instead of accepting her loss, she, while the other woman was asleep, put her dead baby in the place of the live baby. And the next morning when the woman awoke, she saw that the child was not her child. And they brought this dispute before King Solomon to try to solve this problem. There were no other people living in the house. Each of them said that the child was mine. And no, it's mine. So this argument went back and forth. And as a result, Solomon gave a command. And the king said, "Get me a sword." So that they brought a sword before the king. And the king said, "Divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other." And then the woman whose child was the living one spoke to the king, for she was deeply stirred over her son, and said, "Oh, my lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him." But the other said, "He shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him." So after seeing the emotional response of the true mother and how she truly cared for the child's life and the other woman didn't, Solomon was able to say, "This is the mother, give her the child." And when word about this reached the people, they respected the wisdom of God that was in Solomon, and they were deeply impressed with his power to judge. And then we're told about the way that in wisdom Solomon appointed different officers for the state of Israel, and the 12 different areas that he divided the nation up into as tax districts that he was able to put people over to raise taxes for the kingdom. We're told about the extent of the power of his kingdom. He ruled all the way from the Euphrates River down to the river of Egypt. So he fulfilled all of the promise that was given to Abraham about the land promise was fulfilled in the days of Solomon. It talks about the daily consumption of food that the royal house received. 22 to 24 talks about this, verses in chapter 4. It was enough provisions that are mentioned there for at least 14,000 servants in Solomon's kingdom. Maybe as many as 35,000 that were working for the king and were being fed at the king's table. He controlled all of the land that was west of the Euphrates River. We're told about the fact that he multiplied horses, had 4,000 at least chariot horses, 1,200 other cavalry horses that he was able to use. This seems to be a violation of what God said to the kings in the law in Deuteronomy 17:16, not to multiply horses. I don't know if Solomon thought, this wasn't enough multiplying to violate that command, but it certainly seems to be. Profound wisdom that he had was so great that his fame went through all of the kings of the earth, heard about the wisdom of Solomon. He had, as described in chapter 4 and verses 29 through 34, great practical wisdom, great discernment about the nature of things. He had great breadth of mind in knowing about so many different subjects. It says that his wisdom was like the sand on the seashore for its abundance and greatness. He was superior to all of the wise men of the East, all of the wise men in the land of Egypt, even wiser than all of the wise men that were well known that were in his own nation. Naaman and Ethan are two that wrote some of the Psalms, and he was wiser than them. He wrote 3,000 proverbs during his life. About 1/3 of those proverbs are preserved for us in the book of Proverbs. He wrote 105 songs. Only 3 of those songs have been preserved in the Holy Record, and that's the Song of Songs and Psalm 72 and Psalms 127. He also had great scientific knowledge for his day. He knew about all different kinds of trees, from the largest to smallest. He could discourse and talk about all of the different kinds of animals. He talked about the fowl of the air and about the fish of the sea. And again, his wisdom was so great that ambassadors were sent from all over the earth that they might come and hear his wisdom upon all of these different subjects. So never a man so wise as Solomon, before or after. We're told about his preparations for the building of the temple in 1 Kings chapter 5, that he continued the good relations that his father had with Hiram, the king of Tyre. And with those Phoenicians, they sent servants to Solomon at his ascension to the throne and showed their goodwill. Solomon sent a letter to Hiram telling him about how he was going to build the temple and his need for cypress wood and the different wood that could be brought into Israel from the Phoenician lands and from Mount Hermon. And so the cypress trees, they make a covenant that they're going to bring skilled workers and timbers down to Solomon. Hiram thanks God for Solomon's wisdom and is going to float down on rafts these cedar and cypress trees, the logs, and then the Israelites will take them from the coast, the 30 miles up to Jerusalem for the building of the temple of God. You can see in that chapter the organization of labor that they had. When you total it all up, 180-something thousand workers altogether were laboring for 7.5 years to build the temple for the Lord in the city of Jerusalem. A tremendous project. The most magnificent temple in the world, a wonder of the world, was built as the dwelling place for Jehovah God by Solomon. We're told in chapter 6 about a description of the temple that Solomon made. It is an important chronological note that is given in chapter 6 and verse 1. It says that this temple was started 480 years after the Israelites came out of Egypt, which gives that early date for the Exodus, probably about 447 BC is when the Exodus took place. And here you have a long number to help you see how long the period of the judges and then the period of Saul and David, 480 years up to this time. You can see in the description of this temple just how magnificent it was. As you look at the description that's given there, of course, you had the porch that was built on the front with the two great bronze pillars to represent the almighty power and strength of the Lord God. And you had laid out on a similar pattern as to what the tabernacle was laid out with the holy place, except everything is, the dimensions are twice as great. Instead of 10 by 20, it's 20 by 40 in the holy place. And instead of 10 by 10, it's 20 by 20 by 20 in the most holy place. And their storehouses and the dimensions are given for the sides of the temple that run round about. And so a magnificent temple is built for the Lord. We're told about the interior of the temple as well, that it is built and overlaid after the wood paneling and carvings are made on the walls of cherubim and palm trees and other things, that they put sheets of gold over the top of that wood paneling and covered it floor and walls with gold. And just a magnificent temple. All of that gold that was laid up by King David from all of his conquest was used, and there were even precious things that were left over. Precious stones were embedded also in the floor. This temple is a representation of God's dwelling place in heaven, the most holy place. Giant cherubim were placed on either side of where the ark was placed. There in that room with no windows in the deep darkness is where the throne of God would be set, the Ark of the Covenant between those cherubim. And they had the poles of the ark stretched out, and so that they stuck out up against the veil. And at certain times when the veil was open for the high priest once a year to go in, you could see those staves, those poles that they used to carry the Ark of the Covenant when the when it was opened up. It could be seen from the holy place. So, magnificent temple. God says, concerning this house which you are building, if you will walk in my statutes and execute my ordinances and keep my commandments by walking in them, then I will carry out my word with you, which I spoke to David your father, and I will dwell among the sons of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. So God sends a prophet to Solomon and again gives him a promise that if he will keep the commandments, it is a conditional covenant that is made. God has many great and magnificent promises that are made to Israel, just as he makes them to Christians. But they're conditional promises that are given to us. We have to hold up our end of the covenant, just like Solomon and Israel needed to do, for God to continue to dwell in that temple. We're told about other construction projects. These took up to 14 years for Solomon to finish these other things. In addition to the temple, he went on and built a house of the forest of Lebanon in verses 2 through 5 of chapter 7, the porch of pillars, the hall of justice, a palace for himself, the palace of Pharaoh's daughter, and we're told about the stones that were cut and how they were placed and what precision with which they were made. We're told about the courtyards that were built, and just a magnificent building project there on Mount Moriah that was carried out by Solomon and all of these workmen. Then we're told about all of the metal workers that Hiram had sent and the different artisans that worked, and they're introduced in chapter 7 verses 13 through 51, how they built that massive bronze pillar, about all the furnishings and implements that were put in the courtyard of the temple, the brazen sea, which was a great water reservoir that was built and held, several, like 17,000 gallons of water that they were able to use to purify the temple there where they were making all of those bloody sacrifices. They used it to fill another 10 smaller mobile lavers that were built, and we're told about that in the chapter. There's a summary of all of Hiram's work that was done. Other metal objects were made for the inner court, the altar of incense, the golden table of showbread. There were 10 of those inside Solomon's temple. There were 10 lampstands, where there was just one lampstand in the tabernacle, 10 inside Solomon's temple. They made the tongs and the bowls and the snuffers and the basins of gold and different spoons and censers and hinges and sockets and all that were made by Hiram's metal workers. Many of these things made out of gold, these different objects of used in the worship. So, magnificent temple. Then in chapter 8, we're told about the dedication of the temple in Jerusalem. And there's great detail given. Probably one of the greatest religious celebrations in the whole Old Testament, maybe the greatest, is when all of the representatives of the tribes of Israel came. They came at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall of the year, which was a joyous feast. And they had a 7-day feast before that at the dedication of the temple, and then that was followed by 7 days, the 8 days of the Feast of Tabernacles that followed. So a great procession of dedication. The first thing they had to do was take the Ark of the Covenant from the tent that David had made in Zion and bring it up to the temple and take it into the most holy place in the new temple. And we're told that it was installed in the temple, and the glory of God appeared in the most holy place. It was filled with smoke of his presence, and because of the smoke, the priests were unable to minister for a period of time inside the temple. So God showed his approval of this temple, that he was going to dwell there. Solomon then gave a speech of dedication in which he talked about the promise that had been fulfilled that God had made to David. He talked about how God had chosen David to be ruler over Israel, and about how David had had the desire in his heart that was praised by God to build a temple for God. But God had told that he couldn't do it, but that his son that would be raised up would build the temple. And he had raised up Solomon. And of course, Solomon built the physical temple. The ultimate temple of God was built by Jesus Christ, which is the church. He set a place for the ark. God had appointed this place. They'd been in the land all of these years, and God had said that they were to worship in the place that he chose for his name. And now he's chosen Jerusalem, and he's chosen his temple there in Jerusalem as that place. Solomon went on in his prayer of dedication, lifting up his hands to God and speaking his adoration to God. He understood that God was too great to dwell on the earth, in any house that anybody could make here on earth. But he asked that God, who dwells in heaven, might regard the prayers that are offered at this temple, that he might open his eyes toward those that come and pray at the temple and towards that place, that he would listen to their prayers and hear them in heaven and would forgive. He also made special petitions for the people in regard to their prayers that were offered towards that temple. He asked that God would hear all the oaths that were taken there before the altar, and that he would give punishment to those that violated those oaths. After military defeat, or if the people were taken into exile, that he would hear their prayers towards the temple and bring them back. During a drought, if they were punished by God for disobedience, that God would hear and forgive and bring them back. If they had famine or pestilence or blight or mildew or blasting or locusts or any sickness that they were punished with, that God would be gracious, that he would hear their prayers at the temple and on their repentance forgive them. If foreigners come to God, may God hear them at that temple. And maintain your people in battle that come and pray before that temple. Captivity in other foreign lands, far or near, when they pray, restore those captives. There's a final appeal that Israel would be his people, his inheritance, that he might be heard because they're the people he delivered from Egypt, that he had made his own special possession. And he offers a blessing because of all of the good things that God had done for him and for the nation. And he offers a great celebration of dedication. We're told that the benediction that was offered in verses 54 through 61, that he had fallen to his knees at some time during that prayer, and he arose and blessed the assembly and asked that God be with us. He inclined his ear to us, and that we might incline our hearts to him, and that God might maintain the cause of the king and of the people Israel, that he would let the hearts of the people be totally devoted to God, that God answered all of these things with fire. We're told fire came down and burned up the sacrifice, just like he did at the first time that they worshiped at the tabernacle at Mount Sinai. After they constructed it, God's fire came down and burned up the offering and showed his approval of their worship on that occasion. He does the same thing here at the worship the first time at the temple, and God's glory appeared in the temple. So there was a great celebration there of dedication. The king and the nation offered sacrifices. We're told on that day that peace offerings of 22,000 oxen were offered, 120,000 sheep. Now, when these sacrifices were made, they only offered the fat of the animals, and the rest were used as a feast for the people. The whole inner court of the priests was sanctified and was used as an altar to God. So they must have had many altars set up all around for all of these animals to be sacrificed, their blood to be sacrificed upon. So the Feast of Dedication lasted 7 days. Then the Feast of Tabernacle followed 7 more days. And on the 8th day of the second feast, then Solomon blessed the people and dismissed them. So what a glorious days that were when they finally had dedicated that temple to God. What are some of the themes and lessons that you can learn from the prayer that Solomon offered up? Well, he said in the prayer that heaven is God's true dwelling place. He doesn't dwell here on the earth. The earth is his footstool. But God is too great and mighty to dwell in any single building here on earth. And God has faithfulness and loving kindness is shown, and we should pray to God understanding that. It is also clear from the prayer that Solomon offered that he understood that all men sin, that the nation would surely sin because men are fallible. We all sin. Just as the New Testament teaches, we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. So we need God's forgiveness. We need the salvation that God can offer. He said that people, in order to receive forgiveness, needed to turn to God. They needed to confess their sins. They needed to pray towards the temple. Similarly, in the New Testament, those that have been baptized into Christ, they have a scheme of redemption as well when they sin, that they confess their sins, and God is faithful and righteous by the blood of Christ to forgive us of our sins. God forgives, he teaches, and he provides. And we need to pray that he'd open up our hearts, that he'd incline our hearts to serve him, that he would make us all that we ought to be, and that he would shine upon us and bless us and help us to do all the things that are in his will. God alone knows the hearts of men, and that's made clear in Solomon's prayer. Men should take heed to their way and be righteous and fear God, and return with all of their heart and soul if they fall into sin. So let's all learn from these Old Testament principles and apply them to ourselves today, what we can learn from Solomon and the construction of the temple. God responded to Solomon's prayer and to all of these sacrifices that he offered. We're told in chapter 9 about God's response, that he again appeared to Solomon a second time in a dream. And he pointed out to them that he had heard his prayer. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your supplication which you have made before me. I have consecrated this house which you have built by putting my name there forever. And my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. That is a great passage to help us understand how God dwelled in the Old Testament temple and what it really means for him to dwell in us today, for Christ to dwell in our hearts by faith, or the Holy Spirit to dwell in us. What does it mean? It means that their name is there. They own us. They recognize us. Their eyes are open to our prayers and having fellowship with us in our life. That they'll be with our hearts perpetually is for God to dwell with us. And we all want to conduct ourselves in such a way that we can have that kind of close fellowship with God. That just as he dwelled in the temple of Solomon, he'll dwell in our hearts and life. We're told in verses 4 and 5 that, again, this is a conditional promise that is given by God. If we want God to dwell in the temple, if we want him to dwell in us, then we need to meet the requirements that are given. Here's what was stated to Solomon. And as for you, if you will walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and will keep my statutes and my ordinances, and I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, just as I promised to your father David, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. So Solomon is told he needs to keep up his faithful service to God and not worship other gods. He's also warned, and his house is warned, and the nation of Israel is warned, that if they fall away from the Lord, they'll be brought into captivity to other nations, that the temple will be destroyed in verses 6 through 9. If they turn from the commandments, they serve other gods, they'll be cut off from the land. The temple will become a heap of ruins. Of course, as we read on through the Mosaic age and the kings that follow, we find out, as we're going to study next week, that Solomon in his old age allowed his many wives, foreign wives, to turn his heart away from God. And as a result, he's going to lose his family. 10 of the tribes of Israel are going to be torn away from his son. And we know that over time, their idolatry and disobedience is going to lead to the captivity of the northern kingdom, the captivity of Judah, and to the destruction of this temple. So all of these things come to pass, and they're all examples for us to learn from, that when we make a covenant with God, we need to keep the terms of the covenant and be faithful to it. God is has loving kindness and grace, but we should not abuse that grace, but we ought to be motivated by it to be obedient from our hearts and stay faithful till death, serving the Lord. Well, I hope that this lesson will be a blessing to you, that you'll apply these principles, and that, Lord willing, we can study next time about Solomon's great glory and wealth and wisdom and influence, and then about Solomon's sin, and then how the kingdom of Israel was divided after Solomon's death. God bless you and be with you.